I'm Robert Graves. People call me Bobby. And even though I'm 83, I tell everybody I'm 12. And the people who know me well agree. So I guess I like history. And as a kid, I was always fascinated with the stories. In Oregon, in the third grade, which you're, of course, 8 years old, everybody studies the Oregon Trail. And it was kind of interesting for me because my family came from the Oregon Trail. And we were pioneers in Oregon, arriving in 1847 right here in what they then called Clackamas, Oregon City, and then went out and struck land claims in what was, I guess, the Yamhill District at the time. They didn't really have much of other name. It wasn't Sheridan and Willamina and that stuff yet, McMinnville, but it became that in a short order. At any rate, this was a territory primarily owned by the British. The Jesuit church, Jesuits were here. McLaughlin was here with the Hudson Bay Company. There was a lot of trapping going on, chasing pelts. It had been a country that was run by many different countries. Alaska and Oregon and all that was, of course, Russia. Before that, there was a Spanish influence here because it was part of the great, I guess you'd call it the Spanish Main, because the circle of boats that ran around the Pacific got their water here. And as a result, they named the place, because in Spain there's a place called Oregon. It means sweet. And we became named Oregon because they liked this part of the world because it was considered the sweet country. They got the fresh water, they had timber to repair boats and so forth. There was lots of salmon, lots of game. It was a good place to stop after they'd come all the way from the Philippines around through Aleutian Islands and came in on Vancouver Island, which was Oregon. And everything was Oregon all the way to the California tree line where the timber stopped and everything turned brown. So when we showed up out here, the land was really a place where people squatted. And they all just struck a line with a plow, and they knew that we were going to get this thing granted to them, but there was no recording office or anything. And when they finally got it into a territory status, where it was officially part of the United States, they still had to have a contract because the land had been previously claimed by both the Pope and the monarchy of England. And this made problems later on because we had to deal with these people who owned the land that we now are overlaying a country over. In order to understand how this happened and how it affected us out here, I found that I had to keep going back in time because everything that happened before caused what happened now. And it was confusing to me, and finally I got help. There's large research outfits and law firms and so forth that are digging up this old stuff and trying to reconstruct our history that's been kind of mothballed for a long time. So I like to go back to a point that's kind of neutral to the whole thing, and believe it or not, it's clear back in 1060. In 1060, a man became controlling his country, Normandy. It was a duchy, it was not a kingdom, and he was a duke. His father had been a duke, and he had inherited this thing when he was 7 years old, and when he got involved in running a country. At 7 years old, you have regents that are doing the work for you, protecting you from enemies, and of course there were life-threatening things happening all the time. He grew up in a very stormy childhood. His mother and father, being descendants of the Vikings that actually founded Normandy, they didn't marry themselves in the same way that the Roman Church felt they should, so they were considered not married, and therefore young William was a bastard. And William the Bastard, who we know as William the Conqueror, had to do something to change that. You can't be the Duke of a Duchy and be a bastard. I mean, that's just embarrassing. His father was Robert the Magnificent, so you got to see what he's following there. Well, he had a little problem because being a duke, he had a little feather in his cap because had been promised the kingdom of England. And now how that happened was that the King of England, Edward the Confessor, was in exile. Another Viking group from Denmark had come in and taken over the English Isles for a while, and he had gone into exile because his mom was from Normandy. That was Edward the Confessor. And while he was there, he evidently met William and promised this to William because they were first cousins. And William was growing up and becoming fond of the idea of becoming a king someday. Well, Edward finally got to go back to his country. The Danes left and went home. And he had a strong man behind the throne he was using, a guy named, his son Harold was there when he got close to the end of his life. And Goodwin, his strong man, had been dealing with the Scots and the Welsh and all these people and doing all the strong arm, heavy lifting stuff for Edward. He felt kind of indebted to him, and at the end of his life, he gave the kingdom to his son. So now you got two people that have been given the kingdom, and only Harold puts on the crown. Well, William was a little annoyed at that, so he mounted up a expedition. He crossed the Channel in 1066 to settle an issue, and at the Battle of Hastings, he killed the opposition. So Harold's dead, his brother's dead. William's running around mopping up any resistance and gets crowned King of England on Christmas Day, 1066. He's now a king. He was a duke, and now he's a king. Well, he saw this strange walled city while he was there called Londinium, built centuries before by the Romans, that was so powerfully defended that he didn't want to spend time with it, so he bypassed it. And as he left the country, he gave them a charter and said they could be a city-state. He didn't care. Went back to Normandy and lived a long life. Well, 4 generations later, you've got a similar situation. His great grandson, or grandson, one or the other, is Henry II, and Henry II is the King of Normandy and King of England, and because he's the inheritor of the crown. Well, the way this goes is you find out that the Pope controls this crowning of kings. The Pope puts the crown on the head in the coronation. And as a result, then, these kings all over Europe are beholden to the Pope. And if he needs an army to do something, he just raises his hand and says, come on over. And everybody has to supply knights. So here's the Pope trying to do crusades in the Holy Land, and he needs knights, and he raises his hand. Everybody has to comply. If they don't comply, or if they somehow break the rules of being a king, he can pull the crown. And Henry II almost lost his crown just over that issue. One of the archbishops, Becket, got crosswise with Henry, and Henry was trying to use secular law, and Becket didn't acknowledge secular law. He was under the ecclesiastic court of the Roman Empire left over in the Pope's office. Well, that can only go so far, and the Pope's going to win because he controls the crowns. And poor Henry, he got very absolutely frustrated, and evidently within earshot of one of his knights, he said, I wish the guy was dead, and the knight took that as orders and went out and killed Becket. Now Henry's really into trouble because he's going to have his crown pulled, and he's prostrated before the Pope begging forgiveness that it was a mistake, he didn't mean it. But it shows you the power that the Pope had over crowns at that time. And that's going to play into our history as an American nation. What happened was William the Conqueror, being overjoyed with being now a king, wanted to honor his army. And he did. He made them all sovereigns. He decreed them to be sovereigns. Now, the only way you can be a sovereign is to inherit it by blood or have it decreed by another sovereign. You don't earn it on your own. Like being knighted. You can't make yourself a knight. You have to kneel before the king. You get tapped on the shoulder with a sword and all that. Well, it happens that way with sovereigns. And within that army was a family named Belcher. It means kind face or nice personality or something along that line. And they immigrated into England and eventually immigrated into the colonies and happened to be in Massachusetts during the Revolution. And that's an important point to keep in mind. A sovereign in the Continental Army. Now, they don't make a big deal of it these days because it's kind of embarrassing, but in those days, to be a sovereign was a great gift. You didn't pay any more taxes, you paid no duties or fees, all roads and rivers and everything, the ferries were all free. And in England, it just developed into these guys that have 300-room manor houses with thousands of acres of groomed countryside. They chase the hounds and they drink fine scotch and drink nice cigars. They don't do anything. Later, they got involved in the House of Lords, which was kind of balancing out the House of Commons where all the work gets done. But they don't really do much, and I don't even know if they're functioning anymore. But there was a sovereign that made it to the colonies and became part of Washington's Continental Army. And that became a big deal for us at a different point in time. Down through this struggle between England and Normandy, there was a time when a fourth crusade took place, and that took out a lot of the southern lands that were eventually a part of, independent in some nature, but part of the Normandy, Aquitaine holdings and treaties they had that went all the way to the Mediterranean. A woman was raised there, and as a teenager her father died, and she inherited a great tract of land and became the richest woman in all of Europe, Eleanor of Aquitaine. And she had all of Aquitaine near Normandy at the time, and she was married to Louis VII. After the Second Crusade disaster took place, she came home on a separate boat because they annulled their marriage. She was only giving him daughters, and a king has to have an heir, so they just decided to annul their marriage, and she needed to have another powerful man. Women have no political power, but they can have a lot of wealth. Well, here's Henry over there in Normandy, and he decides to marry her. He's 10 or 12 years younger than her, but that doesn't matter. And she gives him a lot of kids, boys and girls. Well, he made her into a baby factory. He even put her under house arrest. She couldn't even get out of the house. It annoyed her quite severely. Well, along the line of children, they grow up. And she had, her second son became quite well known, and everybody knows who he is. Richard the Lionheart. That was her second son. And he grew up defending his mom, and she left Henry, went back to her own lands, and her son, defending her holdings, became quite an expert at castle warfare. I went to her house once. I happened to be in South France with my wife. We were looking into the history of the Cathar people, and we were over in Aude, south of Carcassonne, and I went to her house, spent the day there. It was very well built out of stone. I was impressed. When Richard came back from the Third Crusade, he had an arrow wound that he developed at some point that festered, and he became, as they said, putrefied, means he probably had blood poison, and died in his mom's arm in her house. Well, that might have been the house I was in. I don't know, but it was well built. It was very well fortified. It had about a 2 or 3 acre garden patch with big wall around it, nice and wide for guards to walk on top of. Buildings built into it for processing milk and cream, and root cellars for keeping. It was all self-contained, very beautiful. I liked it. I'm a farm kid, and I appreciated what they had there. Eleanor had to take care of the kingdom of England in her son's absence, because just before he left, his father died, and he became the king of England. Of course, he never lived there. He didn't even speak English. He lived his whole life in France. He spoke Aquitaine, as I understand, and he was kind of an interesting sort of guy. He never took Jerusalem in his Third Crusade. He took out a lot of the forts that Saladin held on the coastline, but he didn't have the manpower to hold Jerusalem, so he came home and the job wasn't quite finished. The Pope wanted a Fourth Crusade, and that's when he decided to instead go to the south of France instead of the Holy Lands, and it became the Eugenian Crusade to take out this parallel Christian group that had a different version of the Holy Land. And the Roman Church didn't want any competition, so they needed to get rid of those guys, so they burned a whole bunch of people to get rid of them and purify their souls. At that time, when that was all going on, there was a lot of land being lost to the new King of England, because when Richard the Lionheart died, his young brother John took over, and he was hopeless. He never won a single battle anywhere. And he began losing all of his lands in the European side, and eventually was forced to go out on the islands and lived in London and Windsor Castle, where he took all of his meals and slept. But by that time, he was pretty much known by the barons as a loser. They didn't want to support him anymore. And then he made a serious, fatal mistake. He began taxing some of the barons' lands. The people on the land do all the work, and they don't own anything, but they're like sharecroppers. And since John had no lands, they called him Lackland John, he was double taxing these people because the barons owned these people, and it was their land that he was taxing and using the sheriff improperly to do this. That resulted in a problem, and they had what they called the Battle of Runnymede, which was a diplomatic battle in a meadow right behind Windsor Palace. So you had the Baron's tents on one side and John's tents on the other side, and John was in the castle. And you had an archbishop from the Pope's office on mediating this thing, and of course it was determined that John had in fact broken the rules of a king, and he got his crown pulled. So unlike his father, he couldn't rescue himself, and he became uncrowned. The crown went to the old city of London, which by that time belonged to the Pope. The Knights Templar had claimed this city-state on behalf of the Pope and started fractional banking there. It's the central bank of the world today, all over the world. The money in your pocket comes from what they do there. They own the Federal Reserve, all of it. So it affects our lives today, and it affects our founders at the time that we had our revolution. It's an important point in history. It has its own king, its own flag. He's called a Lord Mayor. They have an observer in Parliament, but they've never been part of England, never been part of the UK, never been part of the British monarch at all. And the monarch is not really a queen or a king. They're really a property manager. They get to wear the crown one day, and then the crown goes back to the old city of London, where it is today, and the Crown of England is a bank. And that plays into the colonial period. Well, the colonial period, these things had to be paid for. Somebody paid for Jamestown. Somebody paid for Massachusetts Bay. This stuff didn't just come out of a cabbage patch. Somebody had to put money up, and I had family there. Since we're from the Jamestown colony and I'm doing genealogy on my own family, we run into a wall like everybody in the Graves family. We can't figure out what happened to these people, where'd they come from. So I'm looking into this, and I find that somebody else, a lot of people doing the same thing, finding that there's no record on the other side of the pond, Atlantic Ocean, of anything to do with Jamestown colony. And it's maddening until somebody found out that they don't call it that. Well, what do you mean they don't call it that? Well, it's called the London Entrepreneurs. There were investors, and there was a bank involved, and it was the Crown of England. They were the ones that chartered these colonies. Well, law and order was administered by the monarch. And of course, coming down through the ages, you've got quite a lot of monarchs, and a lot of them are descendants. Those descendants are from the Vikings that came into France in the early days through Rollo, the Viking leader, that got Normandy given to him as a duchy when he made friends finally with the King of France after he had attacked the city for quite a while. And as a point in time, this finally petered out with Anne. The last of the Stuart line, that was the end of it. She had no children. Well, they say she died that way. Others say she ran away, came to the colonies, and I have people in Oregon that say they're the descendants of Anne right now, living in Polk County, Oregon. Who knew? At any rate, a country has to have a sovereign as the head of state. All the countries are kingdoms. They're all sovereign, and the land people have no voice at all. So we have a problem there. England had no head of state. They went shopping. They found that there was the Hanover family in Germany, and a branch of that family had nothing to do, so they came over and took the job. They didn't have anything to do with law and order. They had everything to do with representing the country as the head of state. So you had another king brought in, and you had George the First and George the Second and George the Third and George the Fourth and Charles and finally Victoria, all from Germany. In World War I, they changed their name. Nobody wanted to have a German name because it wasn't cool when they were fighting Germany, so they became the name of the palace, Windsor. So now the family's name's Windsor. Well, at that point in time, the colonies being developed one at a time, and some of the colonies being split into more smaller colonies. You have Massachusetts going all the way to Nova Scotia, and then you have a lot of other colonies being broken out of it till it ended up with 13 of them. And these 13 colonies were having problem with these overlords, the property manager, King George III in England. George III probably didn't even know there was a problem. He was insane. He was running naked around Windsor Palace, kissing flowers, hugging trees, and he was a complete embarrassment to the English. They finally institutionalized him. He died there. He never got well. But Parliament had the Keeper of the Privy Seal. They could have a monarch in name. And his son, George IV, became regent, and he took over anyway. But during the war period, and if you look at our documents, he's called the Prince of Peace. The man was sort of innocent of what was going on, but the Parliament wasn't innocent. They were imposing taxes on these colonists and doing terrible things and getting, well, they were putting us in the toilet. That's what they were doing. Benjamin Franklin was interviewed by them one time because the colonies were doing better than England was, and they wanted to know why. And he said, well, our money is controlled printing, and therefore the value of the money stays high, therefore the economy stays good. As soon as they heard that, they came in and took over our money, drove our Continental into the floor. It wasn't worth anything. They destroyed the economy that way. And there's all these wars that England and France were having, which was a property war over cousins. Here you have the 100 Years' War that made Joan of Arc famous. Then you had a 30 Years' War, and then you had a 7 Years' War that we call the French and Indian War, and it's still France and England. They're the same people. It's the same family. They're all from the Normandy people, and they're all fighting each other over land. And they're making big bills. So now you have Louis the 16th. He's in debt. He's got a lot of money, but he has a big bill. And you have the government in England, the Parliament, and they're trying to reclaim losses. So they take it upon themselves to take money from the colonies because, you know, they're the ones that won. They got the benefit of the French and Indian War, so why shouldn't they pay the bill? So they started raising duty on stuff that was being brought in on the boats, and our longshoremen quit unloading the boats. And then the redcoats came over and got in the longshoremen's face, so they set the boat on fire, and there was all kinds of things going on up and down the coast. Eventually, it became so serious that the Parliament gave the governors of the colonies the power of a king to make law. And that was the straw that broke the camel's back. The governor of Massachusetts started giving edicts to his courts and extended that law to the courts. People living out in the frontier couldn't put up with this, and they were kind of tough guys anyway, and they stormed the courthouse, and they pulled the wigs off of these guys, and they threw them into the street and shut down these courts. They weren't going to have it anymore. And they kept working their way towards Boston, and by that time they got to Boston, there were thousands of them, and half of them had their muskets, and so they had a militia. And they took the guy out of his offices, the governor of Massachusetts, and retired him to his private quarters, stole 4 of his favorite little brass cannons right out from under his nose, and they knew they were standing in it. This is 1775. And it was just a matter of time before Parliament sent the redcoats, the regulars. And that's our Paul Revere ride. That's what that's all about. Paul Revere didn't make the ride. I heard he got too drunk in the tavern to get on his horse and stay there. He fell off 3 times, so other people ran in his name, but they did alert the militia. And the British redcoats did show up, but it wasn't the British are coming, the British are coming. We were all British. It was the regulars were coming, the real army. The highest trained, most powerful army on the planet was going to arrive. And they had no hope of ever standing up against something like that. But they tried. So they had the Concord fight as the British marched up the street. They shot at them from behind trees. They had no military training. Good shots, I suppose, but muskets are muskets, and they are limited in their accuracy. They had that big battle on the bridge, and then finally Bunker Hill. And then they ran away, those that survived, and of course the redcoats just kept coming. Somebody was watching this who really did have a military background. He was named George Washington. And when he realized that these guys had the guts to do this, but they had no training, he volunteered to take over. And so they decided to let him handle it. He became the commander-in-chief of the resistance, and he immediately got busy putting things into place to resist the British power. He hired a Prussian to train some of these troops, trying to make a Continental Army out of them. He never really succeeded. It was just one of those things where, they're tough guys, but it takes a certain type of military training and time to build an army, and the British were the most oiled, well-trained, practiced army on the planet at the time. They just rolled over everybody. And that brings us to the beginning of our revolution, 1775.